Alan, yeah, we've still got that static, Alan. We're going to have to see if we can track that down. Those of you that are out there in Facebook, sorry, but hopefully I'll be loud enough to kind of get over the static that's there in the background. That popped up Wednesday night, and we thought we had it, but I think it's still there a little bit. It's good to be back. Thank y'all for joining us. We have audience here in the auditorium, which is great. And I'm sure we still have several people. Looks like 8 already have signed in out on the World Wide Web. We're glad to have all of you with us today. I enjoyed a couple of weeks' break while James and Robbie spoke to us, both for class and preaching. We continue to work on making that final determination of our preacher. We continue to ask your prayers as that process goes forward. We assure you that we are listening to both your input and to our prayers and encouragement as we make that final decision as to who will be our full-time preacher here at Crosswinds. So we're back to the book of Joshua, and just a quick review, maybe a little more in depth today because we have had a couple of weeks break. But it's one of those great books that talks about God, faith, obedience, and how God is on our side. In chapter 1, the whole thing was about encouragement, encouragement in different ways, how God encouraged his new leader, Joshua. Joshua encouraged his subordinate leaders who encouraged the people, who then turned around and encouraged Joshua. So we saw a full chapter of encouragement. And we kind of summarize up what we call the Joshua's Code with the definition of success in life, to stay in the Word of God until we find the will of God so that we can walk in the ways of God. And all three elements of that are really important because you can't walk in the will of God until you know what it is. So you're going to have to find that, and we find that in the Word. In chapter 2, we studied about the convert in Canaan, Rahab, and a clear demonstration of faith, who a total non-believer, who without a preacher or anything like that, heard about what God was doing with his people, and she wanted to be a part of that. Maybe out of fear for her life, maybe out of awe and admiration from God, maybe a little of all of that. But she demonstrated real faith and is an example of faith in both the Old and the New Testament. We talked about in that chapter that faith involves the whole personality, the mind, the emotions, and the will, which goes back to staying in the Word till you find the will and the walk. It involves those same three elements. Chapters 3 and 4, the focus of the book moves to the faith of an entire nation. And God demonstrated three things that were necessary for us as well as his people back then to move ahead by faith. And those three things are the word of faith, the walk of faith, and the witness of faith. Again, what does it need? What do we need to know to be faithful? How do we live to be faithful? And then how do we share that faith with those around us? Bringing the nation out of Egypt was only the beginning of their journey, and Christ bringing us out of sin is only the beginning of our journey as well. God brings you out so that he can bring you in. And we alluded to the fact of the priest as they waded into the water. That was when the waters of the Jordan spread. We've got to get our feet wet too in the work of the Lord. In chapter 5, we saw the nation preparing for victory and talked about how we as people need to be spiritually prepared as well as we begin our mission and our journey in our Christian life. Time spent in preparation is not wasted. In chapter 6, the conquest began. Obedience of God's off-the-wall commands resulted in a complete victory for God's people. Victory is already won. I've said this several times throughout the course of this lesson, and it's going to be in the days as well. Our victory is already won. Christ won that victory when he was raised from the dead. He defeated Satan. He defeated the evil powers. The victory is won. We got to get through a few battles before we get there, but the victory is won, and the outcome is certain already. Chapter 7, we saw the consequences of disobedience. We've been talking about obedience. Now we have consequences of disobedience. And they were defeat, discovery, and death as Achan sinned and caused the people to be defeated. In chapter 8, we saw a reinforcement of God's expectation of obedience and rewards that follow obedience as they purged the sin from the camp, and then they were very successful in the conquest of Ai and the destruction of Ai. And then now we're ready for chapter 9. We have met the enemy, and he is our neighbor. We're actually kind of going to lump 9 through 12 all together. 9 and 10 fit together very closely, and 11 and 12 is kind of an interlude period where they start talking about, all the different kings that were defeated and the cities that were defeated. And so it's just really a whole lot of, and this king was beaten and whatever. So we're kind of going to lump those together all in at the end of chapter 9 and 10. So this will be a pretty big segment we're going to cover in the next couple of weeks. Chapter 9, though, we have met the enemy, or we have met our neighbor and he is our enemy, records 3 stages of Joshua's second failure. Again, we're going to see Joshua as a human. He's a man. He's a person. He's influenced by things just like we are. And he was influenced by the report of spies that we don't need to take Ai seriously. And the result, they were defeated. And now in chapter 9, he's going to fail again. And he's also going to fail again because he's listening to the wrong people and being influenced by them. But fortunately, chapter 10 tells us how God turns that mistake, that blunder, into a victory for his people anyway. Somebody once said a dentist's mistake is pulled out, a lawyer's mistake is put in jail, a teacher's mistake is failed, a printer's mistake is corrected, a pharmacist's mistake is buried, a postman's mistake is forwarded, and an electrician's mistake is shocking. Lots of people make mistakes, and there are consequences when we make mistakes. Joseph Conrad wrote, "It's only those who do nothing that make no mistakes." And that is a paralysis that we find in the world today. People that are so afraid of making a mistake, they don't want to do anything. McKenna asked me to watch Hamilton with her. I guess that was Friday night. We watched Hamilton. And as I was reviewing over this, it made me think of Aaron Burr. He just didn't want to take a stand. He didn't want to get nailed down or pegged down to a stand because then he could be held accountable. It might be a mistake. But people who go forward, people who accomplish great things, make mistakes. How many mistakes did Thomas Edison make? What he said, it wasn't finding the one light bulb that worked. It was knowing that there were 9,999 things that didn't work. Making mistakes is a part of life. In Joshua's case, his mistake was doing nothing. So let's look at that. There are three stages of his mistake here. The first one was believing the enemy. So we've seen the kings of England. Sorry, Rosemary. We've seen the kings of Canaan fall before the children of Israel. And there's a lot of kings. And so far, 2 have tried to stand and 2 have failed. And they have failed miserably. And they have been utterly destroyed, they, their cities, and their people, because of their failure. So the kings of Canaan have been watching this, and they decide, we probably ought to quit fussing among ourselves and get together, because these guys are evidently a lot tougher than we thought they were. And so we need to band together. So Joshua 9, 1 through 2 tells us, when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland all along the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, and it lists them, Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, heard this, they gathered together with one accord to fight Joshua and Israel. These guys didn't get along. They fought each other all the time. There was constant conflict and squabble over little pieces of territory that they controlled outside the big cities and things. They didn't get along, but we all know the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they now have a common enemy, and they join together in order to defeat the common enemy, which is Israel. But Israel's greatest danger is not an alliance or a coalition of kings that are coming against them, but a simple group of men who, under the pretext of lies and deceit, are going to approach them and try to get them to not do what God said. And so that's where the true danger is coming from. Sometimes Satan comes as a roaring lion. Peter tells us in 1 Peter 5:8, "Be sober, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking one to devour." You know, sometimes the lion chases you down, but when a roaring lion is out there, we generally tend to pay attention. We don't want to get too close to a roaring lion. I've not ever been in Africa on a safari, but I don't think I would be comfortable sleeping in a tent in the middle of the night and hearing lions roaring out there in the area around me. I think that would make me nervous. Satan is sometimes like that lion. But then 2 Corinthians 11:3 tells us, "But I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ." Sometimes Satan's not a roaring lion. He's a slithering serpent, stealthy and silent and sneaking up on us and doing what he can to interfere in our lives. And so today, Joshua is going to deal with some Satan-like deceit from the men of Gibeon. Defense against Satan requires us to be alert and use the spiritual armor that he's given us, as Ephesians 6:10-18. So what did the Gibeonites do? Let's look at verses 3-5. "When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they on their part acted with cunning, and went and made ready provisions, and took worn-out sacks upon their donkeys, and wineskins worn out and torn and mended, with worn-out patched sandals on their feet, and worn-out clothes, and all their provisions were dry and moldy." That sounds like a setup, doesn't it? It's 25 miles from where the Israelites were to the city of Gibeon. 25 miles, not very far. But they wanted to make it look like they had come a long way, and there's a reason for that. Gibeon is a city in Canaan, and according to what God told Moses and the people in Deuteronomy 20:10-20, every city in the land of Canaan is to be utterly destroyed. You kill it all. You kill them all, okay? You kill all the soldiers, take the women and kids as slaves, take what animals you want, but basically we're wiping out these people that are in the land of Canaan. And then he says, but, you know, after you conquer the land, you may get into a fuss with somebody else. And if you get into a fuss with them, you don't have to kill all of them. You can take them as slaves and use them that way without that utter destruction that's required of children in the land of Canaan. And so the Gibeonites somehow have heard about this. I don't know where they got this knowledge, but they realize that if they're not from Canaan, they can basically surrender and live. That's where they're coming from. They would rather surrender and live than to be conquered and killed because of where their city is located. So you mean bad people and sinners know how to use God's word for their own purposes? Yep. The Gibeonites did. Of course, the most famous example of this is Matthew 4:5-7, when the devil took Christ up on the temple and said, "It is written, you know, if you fall, that the angels will bear you up lest you strike your foot." Satan using Scripture against God's people. Nothing is off limits to Satan. That's the thing we forget so many times. Nothing is off limits to Satan. He will use holy things, and he will pervert them for his benefit. And of course, if it's for his benefit, in all probability, it's to our detriment. But he can use holy things in order to do that. He quoted the Bible to Jesus, not some new baby Christian who doesn't know any better. He quoted or misquoted the Bible to Jesus, who knew it. You know, and so if he's willing to do that and pervert a passage to Jesus, we've got to be on guard. We have got to be careful. We've got to live by the Bible and not by the verse. I heard that somewhere one time, and I kind of like that. Live by the Bible and not by the verse. If we get too focused on the verse, we lose focus. We see what the verse says, but that verse has to be taken in the context that the passage is and the context of the Bible as a whole. And so it's important that we live by the Bible and not the verse. Make sure you understand the context of a passage when you're studying it. It is important. The Gibeonites put together a delegation that looked like they were foreigners that had finally ended a long, dangerous, difficult journey. Satan is a counterfeiter and masquerades as an angel of light. 2 Corinthians 11:14 says, "No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light." And these men disguised themselves as something they were not in order to lead God's people astray. Satan employs false preachers and deceitful workmen, binding the lost and seeking to lead believers astray. 2 Corinthians 11:13 summarize that. I changed the word false apostles to preachers, but other than that, that's what 2 Corinthians 11:13 says. It's easier to identify a roaring lion than a slithering serpent to get into our lives, but the slithering serpent does get in. So, what did the Gibeonites say? Joshua 9, 6 through 13. I'm not going to read all that, but I'm going to kind of hit the highlights of it. As they got to Joshua in the camp in Gilgal, they said to him, "We've come from a far country. Let's make a deal. Let's have a treaty or a covenant." Israel is a little suspicious, though, because in verse 7, the men of Israel said, "Maybe you live among us." I think that's interesting. It's easy to overlook that verse. They weren't just totally brainwashed by this. Maybe you live among us and you're just trying to fool us. But in verse 8, they said, "Oh, no, we're your servants." And Joshua said, "Who are you? Where do you come from?" They said, "A very far country. Your servants have come. Because the name of the Lord your God, we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt." That's certainly true. And all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, Sihon and Og. And all our elders and the inhabitants of our country said, "Take provisions in hand for the journey and go to meet them and say to them, 'We are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us.'" And then evidence of that, here's our bread. When we left home, this bread was warm and toasty right out of the oven. And now it's moldy and crumbly. That's just physical evidence of how long and hard our journey's been. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and now they are burst. And these garments and shoes of ours are worn out from a long journey. What are they doing? They're lying through their teeth. They are lying. Satan is a liar and the father of lies, John 8:44. And they're telling several lies. One, they're from a far country. Two, they lied about their food and their clothing. 3, they lied about who they were. They're claiming to be official envoys on an official peace mission. They lied about being your servants instead of your enemies. Those are bad enough. But the big lie was when they said they came because of the name of the Lord. They came because of the name of the Lord. Cliff? They were scared, but they weren't coming because they wanted to. Yeah. And I think you're right. They were scared of him. That obviously is why this whole concoction got brewed up in order to do this. It's interesting that they mention the victories on the other side of the Jordan. You notice the victories they didn't mention? Yeah, they didn't mention Jericho and Ai. But again, that's deceit, right? Do you think they knew about them? Oh, I'm sure they did, right? But if they really had left a far country a long time ago, it might be very reasonable that they hadn't heard about those two defeats yet. So they limited their witness, I guess, to what happened on the other side of the Jordan in order to make it more believable. So, some people can just tell lies. Even though the Israelites were a little suspicious there in verse 8, that maybe you really live among us and you're just fooling us. Yes, ding, 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 But they're such good liars that they blow that off. And they get past that, and then they start sucking it up. Right. That's right. Cliff said that they have come to the conclusion that there's nothing we can do to defeat these people and their God. So we either do something and survive, or we die, and that's where they are, and that's definitely where we're going. But some people are just good liars. My granddad, bless his heart, a long time ago, one of the sayings, and I see on Facebook every once in a while, what was a favorite saying of your dad or whatever? I've got lots of sayings from my background, and y'all hear a lot of them. And you've heard this one before too, but Papa always would talk about somebody and he'd say, well, he'd rather climb a thorn tree and lie as sit in a cane bottom rocker and tell the truth. And that's a long way of saying that guy, you can't believe a word he says, right? And these guys are good liars. There are people who are good liars. And they take people who are trusting and believable, and want to see the good in people. They take them in a lot. Some people can lie more convincingly than honest people can tell the truth. Sometimes an honest person gives those symptoms of anxiety or nervousness, even when they're telling the truth. They don't come across very good, but some people could lie about anything and get away with it. Why did the Gibeonites succeed? So verses 14 and 15, they succeeded because, we'll go ahead and read them. So the men partook of their provisions and did not ask direction from the Lord. There's their problem. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. The Gibeonites succeeded because Joshua and his officials are in a hurry. They're ready to get this land conquered. We have waited and waited and waited. Even taking a little city like Ai took a lot longer than it should have. The city of Jericho, although, 7 days is pretty quick to conquer a city like that, especially if you're looking at the normal way would have been a siege and starve them out or anything. It was still 7 days. And the ones from the other side of the Jordan can't go home till this is all over. And the land's not going to be divided until this is all over. They're in a hurry to get this over with. And so, because they're in a hurry, they walked by sight and not by faith. They took a scientific approach instead of a spiritual approach. They listened to what they said. They looked at what they brought. And from a scientific, from a logical, from a reasonable perspective, everything they said made sense, right? But everything they said was wrong. Click. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Never invoke God, which they did the same thing when they decided to attack Ai. They got together, they listened to the spies, and the leaders decided, let's go, and do that. And so it's exactly what they did at Ai in chapter 7. But the thing is, we have to be careful because a good liar can tell us lots of things that make sense and look good, and every bit of it can be wrong. And in a world that is weighted heavily for what I like and what I think and what I want and all that other eye trouble that comes from all of that, we get caught up in what sounds right and looks right. And it can sound right and look right and still be wrong. The Hebrews got eye trouble again. Their success at Ai made them cocky. Their success at Jericho made them cocky, and they got defeated at Ai. Then their ultimate victory at Ai made them cocky, and they're going to give away something here that there's no reason for them to give away to the city of Gibeon. They forgot to wait for God and seek His direction. James 1:5, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives all men generously and without reproaching, and it will be given to him. How long does it take to just consult God? We see Joshua several times consulting with God, praying to God, talking to God for guidance and direction, but not here. Not here. He's just in too big a hurry. A little patience and thought might have resulted in the story being suspicious. And it was, because verse 8 tells us they were a little suspicious of it, but not enough to really go to God and say, is this a real thing or not? Because if you think about it, if you're a delegation from a foreign place, who do you send on a delegation? Do you send poor people who don't have any outward signs of prestige or power? Is that who you want negotiating for you? Not usually. If you're going to send somebody to negotiate, especially a peace treaty here, you want to convey, we're powerful, we're rich, we're wealthy, we want to be your friend. There's something for you in this process as well as for us. It's not we just want to, just be buddies. You're going to gain something because of that. And yet these guys have none of those outward signs of power or prestige. They're worn out clothes. Their shoes are wore out. I mean, just basic things. You would think their bread is moldy. Don't you think people that would be chosen as a delegation would be successful enough? They would probably have servants that would know how to cook on a journey. Not unusual for people to take journeys. They don't always start with everything they're going to have as they leave and wind up eating a bunch of moldy bread. They got a sack of flour and they make bread along the way. That's a normal thing if you just would have stopped and thought about it. True faith involves patience. Hebrews 6:12, so that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Joshua and the leaders did not exhibit much patience here. Moses clearly warned them not to make treaties with those living in the land, and he told them why. Exodus 34:12. Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land whither you go, lest it become a snare in the midst of you. Be careful. Don't make covenants. What are they going to do? Make a covenant. Okay? They should have been warned and should have been aware. Joshua and his advisors, in their haste and maybe in their pride, broke God's law and made a sworn covenant with the enemy. And now it's done. Now it's set. It reminds me of King Nebuchadnezzar. The last thing he wanted to do was throw Daniel in the lion's den. He didn't want to do it, but he had made a law. And because he had made a law, the law had to be fulfilled. Couldn't be changed. We see the same thing with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were not going to break that law. And once that law was made, it was put into a place. And so here, God's law was don't make a covenant with them. They did, but now they're stuck with the covenant. They swore an oath in God's name, and it can't be broken. Joshua 9:18. But the people of Israel did not kill them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. And then all the congregation murmured against the leaders. They're stuck with their decision. Today, God's people live in a world surrounded by spiritual enemies. They will be quick to engage us in negotiations for compromise. The slippery slope. Okay? Our enemies will be quick to engage us in negotiations for compromise. Not a new plan. What did the Satan tell Eve? You really won't die. The Bible is out of date. It doesn't apply to today's world. That's one we hear, right? You're not really going to go to hell. There's no such place as hell. That's just a biblical story. I don't think that's what God meant when he said. Of course, the first part of that's the problem. Trouble. I don't think that's what God meant. That is a dangerous position, as Nathan has showed us in the book of Job. To start trying to reason what God's thinking and why he does what he does, I think is very dangerous. And yet, how often do we hear that as an explanation for why things that one group of people believe is doctrinal and is black and white and not negotiable, but to other people, they don't see a problem with it because they don't think that's what God meant. Another one that Satan tells us is, well, you know, you're better than that guy. We look around the church and we think, man, I've got problems, but I'm better than that guy. And that's in the direct contradiction of Romans 3:22 and 23, where it says, for there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It doesn't matter about the next guy, okay? But they want you to believe that you're better than the next guy. Proverbs 3:5 and 6 tells us, trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. 1 John 5:2-4. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and we obey his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. For whatever is born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith. So we have to be really careful how we listen to our enemies. The second stage of failure that Joshua and the leaders go through is enlisting the enemy. Joshua 9:16-27. Well, they messed up, okay? They made this binding covenant to not kill the people of Gibeon. We're going to accept you as an ally. You're safe. How did Joshua find out what he'd done? It doesn't tell us. We don't really know. It took 3 days for them to find out. Maybe they just had a big party and celebrated not dying, and that's how Joshua and the leaders found out. Maybe they let it slip. Maybe they bragged about it. We really don't know. Maybe as Joshua and the leaders sit down to plan the next series of conquest, they come to the cities around Gibeon. And they go, oh, wait a minute, time out. We forgot to tell you. That's us. You got to deal with us now. You can't do that. However it happened, Joshua found out. Can you imagine the sinking feeling of despair that went through Joshua when he realized he has been duped? You've been had. You know, I think we get that feeling a lot of times, or maybe not a lot of times, but, you know, I said, I don't ever feel like I made a good car deal. I always feel like I should have negotiated harder. I always feel like I didn't quite get what I should have in a car deal. Have you ever got sucked in by an email scam? You know, or the guy who lives in a $100,000 house standing at the corner of the interstate saying homeless, you know, need money. It happens to us. But when you find out it happened, there's just that sinking feeling that you get. And I think Joshua had it in spades that day. He was probably embarrassed and humbled and realized immediately what he should have done. It's the way we learn lessons. What I should have done instead of what I did. And that's where Joshua is now. But let's give Joshua and those guys credit. They are men of their word. They are men of their word. It would be really tempting to say, that didn't count. You fooled us. Cliff? Absolutely. Cliff says that's an obligation of the law of God, that once you open your mouth and say something, you're obligated to do it. And that is true, and especially if you do it in the name of the Lord. If there's any wiggle room, it says let your yeas be yea and your nays be nay. But if there's any wiggle room, it's not once you say in the name of the Lord. That makes it ironclad. And these people know enough about God that they got that out of Joshua and them. And so, it might have been tempted to say, deal's off, off with their heads. We're not going to be tricked like that. We're going to kill you anyway. But they had sworn an oath, and violating it would put them in a bad light. Now, this is one of those interesting things that I found that I love to share with the class. And some of you may already know this, and maybe everybody does. It was just kind of new to me. Saul, when he's king, tries to fix this. I had never read that. I mean, I'd read it, but I'd never seen it, heard it, understood it before. Saul thought Joshua got taken in on a deal. I'm going to take up for Joshua. I'm going to get even. I'm going to kill the Gibeonites. So in 2 Samuel 21:2, verses 1 and 2, there was a famine, and it's interesting that this happens in the time of David. Now, there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, there is blood guilt on Saul and his house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. Saul sought to slay them in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. He wanted to fix it. He was zealous. He thought he had a legitimate religious purpose to kill these Gibeonites because they had lied to Joshua. And so verse 1 tells us he put some of them to death. And verse 1 tells us the result. 3 years of famine for God's people because Saul killed the Gibeonites. After 3 years of famine, David finally gets around to doing probably what he should have done earlier and doing what Joshua should have done to avoid this whole mess in the first place and asking God, what's going on? Why are you punishing us? And after 3 years, David seeks God's guidance and discovers what Saul has done to displease God. Did David know this? No, not at all. Again, we see consequences don't always fall on the ones that sin. Saul is dead. Most of Saul's family is dead. But his people are still being punished because of something he did. Just like Achan. Achan did wrong. 36 soldiers died. The whole time frame was messed up. Sin or punishment doesn't always just fall on those who sin. And that's true in our world too. Sin reaches out its tendrils and has negative impact on a lot of people that are peripherally impacted and affected by that sin. As a result of this action by Saul, the nation faced famine, and 7 sons of Saul were sacrificed to the Gibeonites. That's how David ended the famine. He sacrificed 7 sons of Saul. And so that's what happens when you break an oath that involves God's name. Generations later, the oath is broken and God still holds them accountable and still punishes them. We take God's name in vain. We take God's, swear to God. Swear to God. That's, it just rolls off our tongue. So easy to do that. And we have no idea what that means to God. He took it serious in the Old Testament. And I don't really see that that's changed. So we should be careful when we're making oaths and covenants like that. So, Joshua honored the deal that he had made so carelessly with the Gibeonites. The people marched 3 days to the city of Gibeon. And actually there's several cities that are around there, 4 or 5 cities that are kind of lumped together there. So they marched over there, but they didn't take them. And this made the people unhappy. There was that little verse there that said the people were unhappy that the leaders had had made the covenant not to kill them, and the people got unhappy, and they murmured against their leaders, Joshua 9:18. Why are they murmuring? Did Joshua ask them to wear masks to church? What did he do? Well, he cheated them out of a lot of plunder, because remember, now that Jericho's all that plunder was given to the Lord, the rest is theirs. And so here's these cities that are wealthy, big cities, bigger than Ai, rich cities, and we can't touch them. No plunder for us, no payday today, because of the deal you guys made. Maybe it was zeal for God's command. God said to kill them all, and you didn't. It's your fault. So we're going to murmur and be unhappy about you. Maybe it was a fear of pagan influences. That's what Moses said. Anybody that remembered what Moses said about this could have thrown that out there as their card. Moses said, don't make deals with these people because of the pagan influences they're going to have on us. It's easy to murmur when you don't have to make the decisions. As a school administrator, I am so sick of trying to figure out when school's going to start. I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows. It's just we make a plan, and it doesn't even the ink doesn't get dry until that plan's out and another plan is coming. But it doesn't matter what they decide, because I'm not in on the decision making. I'm that intermediate cog that passes it on down and passes it back up. It doesn't matter what they decide. People are going to be mad. You just can't make people happy when you have to make decisions. And yet, leaders have to make decisions. You got to have, at some point, we're going to start back. And whatever change that is, it'll be there. But if you haven't planned and gotten ready, it won't happen. The same thing with church. Look at how COVID has affected church. We went for weeks where we weren't being together. And when we finally said, okay, let's get back together, there were people that didn't like that. We tried to make it really easy. Y'all stay home if you're not comfortable. It's fine. We don't, there's no pressure at all to come if you're not comfortable. And yet we hear the murmuring about, well, I want to come, but I don't want to wear a mask. Or I want to come, but I don't want to sit socially distanced. This thing's not over. And honestly, there are people who have communicated to me that they think maybe we should tighten back up again. We're too loose, even though we're here in class, we're here in preaching. There are people that are nervous about that, worried about whether that's a good thing to do. But leaders have to make decisions, and it's easy to criticize after the decision's made. Joshua's response, though, does teach an important lesson. When you make a mistake, admit it. That's the biggest problem most people have. They can't admit their mistake. There's a real important person in our country. He can't admit he makes a mistake. It's always somebody else's fault or whatever. There's a lot of people that way. Sometimes it's like us. When you make a mistake, admit it, and then make it work for you. I tell people when they ask me advice on making a decision, one of the things that I'll tell them is, it's your decision. You pray about it, you get your research, you make the best decision you can, and then you make that the right decision. Because if you're always looking back over your shoulder and second-guessing your decision, you're not, you undermine your chances of making it successful. Once you make a decision, it's your decision, and you make it the right decision. And that's what Joshua's going to do. He messed up, he admitted he messed up, and now he's going to do what he can to make it work for him. So what he did, the Gibeonites are put to work providing manual labor in service of the tabernacle. All right? So, we're not going to kill you. That's what we said. But I didn't say I wouldn't make slaves out of you. And that's basically what he does. He makes slaves out of them. He puts them in the temple. And in the temple, they're doing what's got to be a really hard job, cleaning up the mess. Okay? We don't, and Steve Larrow talks about this a lot, we don't realize just how messy and how involved sacrifices were. Okay? But it involved lots of burning, and lots of washing and lots of water and wood. And so, okay, Gibeonites, we're not going to kill you, but your job now is you haul the water and you cut the wood and you make sure that the tabernacle always has all the wood and all the water that it needs. And that's your punishment for that. And you know what the Gibeonites said? Fine, because we're still alive. We're not like Ai and we're not like Jericho. We're slaves, but we're live slaves. And actually, in the Bible, there's no evidence that they ever caused problems for the Jews after this. They accepted that role, and they did their job. And in fact, when Jews came back from the Babylonian captivity, I think it mentions there were 300 or 400 of these, they're called Nephilim, came back from Babylon to continue their service in the temple as it's being reconstructed. So that gets us to the third stage, and we'll start there next week.